We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings from Tbilisi, Georgia on this fine pandemic noontime. Just about noon, so we'll call it noontime. This is Burn Power, and I thought what I would do today is talk more about symbolism. Someone asked, and I thought it was a really good idea, that I give more of what I think about certain people who have been prominent lately for their use of symbolism. Among them, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, Carl Gustav Jung. I thought I would also discuss Owen Barfield's connection to symbolism, as well as mention C.S. Lewis and Hans Rookmaaker, all of whom have influenced me on some level, and yet I don't agree with them on some other levels as well. That's because symbolism is complex. And one thing I've noticed is that people now tend to be hunting for symbols. And as I've discussed before, the allegory is a very direct symbol. I'm giving it as a cliche, Jesus equals Aslan the lion. Although I would say Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia is subtler than that. Nevertheless, that is an allegory. People tend to be looking for allegories these days, more than understanding the deeper resonances of symbols. And I think the reason for that is because we want certainty. I think real symbolism doesn't give you certainty, but it suggests things to us. Now, I've discussed this in 2 videos prior to this. The second one was really spending quite a while discussing the films and the thoughts of Andrei Tarkovsky on these subjects. But nevertheless, I think that a little bit of time really is warranted with these other figures. I think for many people today, the first place that they heard of symbolism was probably through Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist. He's obviously the writer of books, including Maps of Meaning, and most particularly 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, or something like that. I don't have the book in front of me. But he became famous for using various symbolic creatures or images from mythology and or popular cinema in his discussions. And I think, first of all, he spends quite a bit of time in the scientific realm, particularly when discussing neuroscience and the relationships of human behavior to evolutionary biology. I'm not going to discuss all of that, but I would like to say this, that he tends to have metaphors and analogies based upon his readings into neuroscience. So, for instance, the most famous one being the lobster. People have brought him to task for comparing lobsters to humans as if there was nothing else in between. But that's not a good reading of Peterson. What he's trying to say is that, hierarchy is built into the animal kingdom, going as far back as I believe it's 12 million years or more to lobsters. I could be getting my date wrong on that. But the point is, the lobster, or is it 120 million years? Something. I'm sure someone will correct me down below because I don't feel like looking it up at the moment. Although maybe I will, and I'll put a little... No, I'm not going to bother to do that because it doesn't matter how many millions of years ago it was. What matters is that he uses the lobster as a symbol of hierarchy. It's not quite a an allegory. The lobster equals the hierarchical being. But nevertheless, he's saying that there's something inside of animals that seems to go towards hierarchy. Now, of course, this is to your egalitarian soul of the moment, this is heresy. And he knows it, and that's why he spends a while detailing it. But what I'm interested in is his use of the symbol. So he also talks about chimpanzees quite a bit and such. Now, I have a problem with using the animal kingdom too closely to discuss the human kingdom. And I think it's a common trope these days. People tend to think that wherever you see behaviors in the animal kingdom, they must somehow relate to us. Some certainly do. But the human being, with our capacity for language and creativity and imagination, music, all of these other things, can't be boiled down to these images. And I don't think Peterson is boiling them down. But I think there has been, a way in which, in our discussion of things, we tend to do something that you can't do. And that is to say that what was in the past related to evolution, which seems to be a growing tree, that somehow we are reduced to that. Whereas Michael Polanyi in his ideas, which Michael Polanyi rarely uses symbols, but in his personal knowledge, great book I recommend reading, it basically talks about a principle of the thing. For instance, you cannot explain the higher thing by the lower thing. In other words, you can't, just because all human beings are water, you can't define us through water. You can say some things for certain. You can say, if I don't get something to drink, I will eventually have some serious problems. Because liquid is important to maintaining our biosystems. But you can't explain my, for instance, ability to talk to you right now, or the invention of a camera to record me, through water. Nor can you do it through another lower feature of the human being, DNA. And what we've seen in modernism is the desire to pull everything apart. Now, this is classic modernism, whether science or art, is to pull everything apart and then use the pieces to explain the whole. It just doesn't work. The whole, let's say we'll talk about me as a human being, cannot be explained by chimpanzees and lobsters. And this is an area where I like Peterson's use of lobsters and hierarchy. I think it's interesting, and I think there is something hierarchical in human beings. I tend to think, because I believe in God, that it starts with God, the hierarchies. You don't have to agree. But the point is that I think as an analogy or a metaphor, a symbolic transformation, I think it's interesting. But where Peterson really starts to shine with symbols is when he does things like uses mythology. So he talks about Tiamat, the Babylonian god of chaos, and talks about how we're always fighting chaos. And he'll say things like, and this he gets from Jung, the female symbol of chaos and the male symbol of order. I'm purposely doing my yin-yang thing here to try to give you a little visual picture. But essentially you have these polarities and dynamics in life. And so he will dig into various mythologies to talk about, to use these as symbols, but more than symbols, as he would often say, instantiations, an instance of, what he's talking about. So, and there, for instance, when he talks about 12 rules for life and antidote to chaos, His chaos is not simply like things, noisy music or, busy street traffic, in a big city or something like that. His chaos starts with things like, the god, the great dragon Tiamat, that is where he starts with it. So for him, dragons are full of symbolic representation, and the fact that the dragon always is related to gold and such. These are very deep symbolic things. And I would say, as far as dragons and gold, there isn't a reason that's really, really, Peterson tries to break it down, but I would say that it's a deep level myth. And there's two senses of the word myth here. One is the myth that explains things, but nothing is explained by the dragon hoarding gold. It's deeper than that. It's something inside of us that we know in our bones. It's very hard to get out, which is why there's so much literature, poetry, art, movies with dragons and gold and dragons, period. Because it's a deeper level symbol. It is a myth, but more in the way C.S. Lewis talks about the myth. Peterson also talks about the symbolic images found, particularly in the opening chapters of Genesis, but he goes all the way through as much as the Bible as he's done. Unfortunately, he got hung up doing endless lectures on all sorts of other things related to his 12 Rules for Life, and never got back to his biblical series, which is something I think many people really wanted him to get back to. And then, of course, his life started to take other turns as well. And now, unfortunately, he's sidelined, recovering. Get well, Jordan, if you ever hear this, which I doubt you will, because there's so much stuff on Jordan Peterson. But, one can think. And but nevertheless, for instance, for him, something like the Garden of Eden is a deep, 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 deep level myth. It's not, and in this case, there is a sense where he will get to the explanation factor, but the fact is that it's a deep level myth, more on the C.S. Lewis line, where it's not simply an explanation as much as it's a revelation of something deep within us. The fact that the first images in the Bible are of a garden. A garden is not the same thing as nature. Nature just grows wild, but a garden is maintained. But a garden is like nature in so many ways. And so that's how he uses it as that ground of who we are. Likewise, at the end of time, what you find in Revelation is not the garden anymore, but the city. And as Jacques Ellul points out, at the end, we will find a recapitulation of everything. And God does not send us back to the garden. And this is, of course, the great mistake the hippies made. They thought, if we just get back to the garden, dude, we'll eventually get back to that thing we left behind. But the point is, you never get back to what you left behind. There is always a sense in which you're going towards something. And what we're doing is, the city is actually the place that we build. And it's actually the place we build, almost going like, God, we can do it on our own. We don't need you. But in the end, God takes the city and says, here's what you really wanted out of it. You wanted a perfect city. You wanted a new Jerusalem. You wanted a place where the closeness of human beings brought people together, not separated them, as cities tend to do. And he gets a lot out of the Cain and Abel story and the ideas of revenge and the idea of deep-bedded evil inside of us. Anyway, it's all complicated. I don't feel like rehashing Jordan Peterson's Symbolism. You can do that by going back and watching his own videos on his biblical series. He gets quite a bit of his symbolic talk from Carl Gustav Jung, who I'll discuss more in a minute. But interestingly enough, he doesn't get it from Joseph Campbell. Now, Campbell is also really a Jungian, but in a different way than Peterson is. Peterson takes great pains in pointing out that there's a lot of darkness in Jung. Whereas if you've watched the Joseph Campbell series that he did, The Power of Myth, with Bill Moyers, and they're talking, one of the things that it becomes clear is that essentially Joseph Campbell always brings it back to so he says, eventually you're going to find your bliss. He's much more of a Hindu in the sense of unifying everything into one cosmic pattern. So one of the things about Campbell that I find particularly troublesome is people's reliance on his hero's journey story. I think Star Wars was ruined by that. I think that one of the stories I love most, Mad Max, was ruined by too much contact with Lucas and Spielberg, although Spielberg is less a Joseph Campbell man. But basically then, in the third one in particular, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, Mad Max is ruined by becoming a Campbellian archetype. Following the hero's journey, which is always that the hero, is here, goes through his valley struggles, and eventually comes out over here. That's a super simplification, but you get the idea. But the truth is, I see lots of instances in great literature where that doesn't happen. Does Hamlet fit that? Does Macbeth is not a hero? But what about the person who doesn't necessarily change? But I think Peterson is smart enough to know that there's something wrong with Campbell's emphasis on arriving at bliss. And I find that to be one of the most suspect parts of Campbell himself. What saves Peterson from falling into that trap, I believe, is his discovery of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, both of whom were Orthodox Christians, both of whom saw the darkness in humanity, both of whom lived in that darkness. And I don't mean the darkness of, a small situation. I mean crushing, soul-crushing darkness. Dostoevsky, epileptic with a gambling addiction who's put up against a firing squad and almost shot to death. And not in that order, but basically, that's experiencing some radical darkness. Fortunately, he found his way out of these things, and it is his wrestling with the darkness he found within himself, which produces crime and punishment, and the demons, and the idiot, and the brothers Karamazov. Also, Solzhenitsyn. Well, he had not only the gulags, but he had, I'm just reading a book right now. I just finished it called Between Two Millstones, in which he talks about his life immediately after leaving the Soviet Union. And one would think, well, now he's free. Now he can do whatever he wants. Oh, no. The grind of the Soviet Union still follows him around. The KGB is still snooping on him. They're publishing strange literature back in the Soviet Union to totally discredit him. And then he doesn't get on the right side of Western politics either. He doesn't understand the way media manipulates things, which he's going to find out to his detriment. He doesn't understand finances, how they work in America, insurance, publishing, all of these things. He doesn't understand the fact that, when he gives like a great speech like his Harvard lecture, which I highly recommend reading, or you can even find a version of it on YouTube. He doesn't understand that when he gives these things, he thinks America is a place that's free and open, and they're willing to hear criticism. Well, yeah, except not from someone from another country. So there you are. It's like, it's not, no, he's not, he didn't get out. It's not like, so he's fighting all of these things. He understands the meaning of pain and fear. So let's talk about Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Gustav Jung is the great Swiss psychologist, philosopher really, who, along with Sigmund Freud, helped to develop the discipline of psychology. And of course, they had a great split. Freud was much more the modernist in the direct sense of there is no God, all there is matter. We will try to explain things through essentially the animal being within man. So Freud invents concepts like libido, which is that animal impulse in man, which we would tend to call more our reptile brain right now. Freud is interesting, though, because he does bring the symbolic back in. And so whether he's talking about this unconscious being drawn to various things, like the Oedipal complex, or these kinds. He uses these phrases. Oedipal comes from the story, of course, of Oedipus, who ends up killing his father and sleeping with his mother. And Freud makes a great deal out of the use of this old myth in order to discuss his, a child's relationship, particularly a boy child's relationship to his mother and father. Now, Jung did not take this sort of animal level behavior approach. Jung instead looked at things like dreams. They both looked at dreams, but where Freud saw the dream essentially as something which could be explained through processes, like sexuality, Jung said, no, that's far too simplistic. You aren't including what everyone knows about dreams, and that's all this other imagery. So Jung came up with all sorts of other concepts related to a broader world. Now, Freud basically said of Jung that, you're an occultist. You are essentially bringing in these things which have no scientific bearing. But Jung would counter basically saying, no, but they have universal bearing. That is to say, all human beings work with these types of images. So, for instance, the dragon is a good thing. Why do all cultures have some kind of snake dragon creature that they're fighting against? Jung came up with the idea of the archetypes, which I find a really fascinating idea. So the archetypes are, for instance, he said that a man goes through different archetypes within his life. Or, even more important, and this is where the ideas of the anima and the animus come in, the anima is the female representation in the mind of a man, based on his relationships with his mother and sisters and other females. The animus is the male representation within the woman that's based on these things. So, based on her relationship with her father and other men. And these things are quite complicated. But to get back to the subject of archetypes, he would say that in a woman, there are, when she sees a man, she sees his animus, but there are different levels. So there's the romantic hero, there's the stern, hard figure, there's the noble, enlightened figure. He actually put them in kind of an order, and I forget the fourth one. But basically, what he's saying is that when we look at people, we tend to cluster them around images that are already preset. And this is where Campbell gets his ideas of universal consciousness and such. Jung used the idea of the collective unconscious. That is to say, unconsciously, we are, in a sense, picking from this thing that's already there as a stew. That has ingredients in it, and we can do no more than to derive things from this collective unconscious, so that the archetypes are already there in life, but not necessarily in life as much as he thinks that it's our interpretation of life. I find it interesting. You can see archetypes. Why do certain Hollywood figures become important? And, for instance, and then more curiously, why are there often 2 or 3 versions of the same figure that arrive at the same time? There are often, like there's a Angelina Jolie and a Charlize Theron. They are very similar as far as the kind of figure they play. They often play a woman who is strong, who is sexual, who is, of course, very beautiful, but she has this kind of underlying sorrow attached to her in a certain way. Well, that figure, as they age, they're getting further apart. I mean, it's the same with musicians. Why did Adele become such an important figure for the 20-teens? It's that there's, in some way, they hit. I think that archetypes actually work given the times. So I don't see it as the kind of picking out from this unconscious stew. I see it more as that times produce different archetypes. That and this goes with my thought that symbols are, everything doesn't have a symbol attached to it as much as symbolic weight is attached through time to certain things, which is why also it's harder to get a certain kind of, what is it? You can't get the same symbolic weight out of, for instance, if I was to take us back to the, 1950s right now and give you a hula hoop, well, you might find it interesting for a couple of minutes, but you'd be hard-pressed to feel why it was a fad in the 1950s. Just as I am sure if you come to someone, say 70 years in the future and hand them a smartphone, they'll look at you, whatever they do at that point, whether the world is in chaos and technology doesn't work, or we've so superseded it that it's injected into our, the back of our nervous system. I think they'll look at a smartphone too and go like, why did they think this was interesting? And that's because I think that the symbolic weight comes and then it's like water. It starts to evaporate from certain things. Now, certain things don't lose their symbolic weight. Jesus Christ does not lose symbolic weight. It changes. Every era interprets Christ a bit differently. But nevertheless, there is a symbolic weight to that. But one could argue that Julius Caesar is another figure that has a lot of symbolic weight. Buddha is another figure that has a lot of symbolic weight. And this isn't discussing what they mean as historical figures or as spiritual figures or anything. But it's just simply to say that some people have lived lives that just have weight in the telling. I think Solzhenitsyn's life will gain more weight in the telling of his story as time goes by, which is evidenced by what happened with Jordan Peterson discussing Solzhenitsyn. I can tell you, as someone who has been reading Solzhenitsyn since the late 70s, that we went through a period in the 90s where you couldn't get arrested talking about Solzhenitsyn in any public forum. I mean, people just simply didn't want to hear it. It's just like, who wants to hear about this guy? We're done with communism. Put it aside. But I think that, so Jung's idea is that there are, however, universal symbols that have some meaning. And like I say, I would disagree with him. I really get into trouble with Jung when he starts talking about God. Son of a Swiss pastor, Protestant. When I hear Jung talking about God, I always wonder who he's talking about. Because I don't think simply saying the word God means you have the same thing behind what you're saying. And this is interesting. So, for instance, if a person were to say God, and in their mind they had Mickey Mouse instead, and I use this because it's extreme and probably doesn't happen that much, who are they really thinking about? That's the big question. So when Jung talks about God, I hear some kind of mythological sun religion almost, bit pantheistic. It's not quite, he doesn't ever nail it down, but it isn't the God of the Bible. That's for sure. He's rejected a good chunk of that. But he's learned to retain the personal language about God in order to do it. And so when people read Jung, they tend to hear the word God as however they're already interpreting it. He's left it squishy enough that you can do that. My other big issue with Jung is, what the heck is a collective unconscious? Is it out there somewhere? It's like, where are you going to dip in for this stuff? Like I say, I think things take on symbolic weight. And in fact, we're going to counter Jung's collective unconscious in a few minutes with some of Owen Barfield's idea about the collective consciousness. So we'll deal with that in a minute. But let's turn to someone I have much more in common with for a few moments, and that's Jonathan Pageau. Jonathan Pageau is a Canadian, Quebecois carver, artist who has brought a lot of attention to the symbolism of the Orthodox wing of Christianity. And since I'm living in Tbilisi, Georgia right now, I can tell you that the person who is a serious Orthodox Christian within this culture takes symbols very seriously. And by very seriously, I do not mean in any way in which, say, your average American, when they hear the word symbol, takes it. Often when Americans hear the word symbol, for instance, we make a real division between symbol and reality. So we say if something's symbol, it's not historically valid. And if something's not a symbol, it's just this hard thing. So this is, for instance, in America, as soon as you say to someone, the Bible is symbolic, they will immediately turn around and go, like, I knew it. In other words, there's no historical validity going on in there. We're done with it. We can now look at its symbology as symbolic. And now, Jonathan Pageau is fascinating because he came out of a Protestant evangelical background, went to art school, got confused, as one tends to by art school, and then ended up eventually... and I will have to, I'm not sure which came first. The Orthodox, I'm pretty sure that his conversion to Orthodoxy came before his changing over, although I think he started studying iconography because he wanted to get away from the modern emphasis on the self in art and just, whatever self-expression. Now, whenever I hear Jonathan Pageau talking about symbolism, particularly when he's giving a lecture or something like this, I find myself with two reactions at once. One, I agree with like 95% of what he's saying. And two, I find at a certain point he goes off in a direction I wasn't expecting, which I find very interesting. And so, he will discuss the Garden of Eden, to go back to Jordan Peterson's idea, but then he'll put it on a hill, a mountain, going back to older symbolic, and I'm sure Orthodox symbolic interpretations of the garden. So that literally the fall of mankind wasn't simply a inside, but literally falling down off the hill. In a sense, you have to leave the hill. Jonathan is great at discussing the symbolism within biblical stories. And at the same time, I know that Jonathan has a great deal of respect for the historicity of the Bible. Now, which parts are, can we say are more, like, for instance, it's obvious to me the first 3 chapters of Genesis, you can't break that down to a historical moment. However, I wouldn't be surprised if there was an Adam and an Eve, and we don't just know when. However, we have received this story to us today. I'm not going to go into trying to defend the validity of the Bible. However, I do think there's lots of room to move. And Jonathan Pageau is very interesting, and I think he's done a great job of getting people to look at Orthodoxy as a much needed antidote to, for instance, the kind of chaos that's been going on in the Catholic churches. Orthodox churches just are not going through that kind of chaos, and you can see that here. Orthodox churches do have other faults, and among them are they tend not to see other Christians from other traditions. They're not sure if they're Christians. Sometimes they're not. We're really not sure. But also the other side, what's happened in Christianity, whether the mainline churches that have just kind of drifted off into whatever interpretation seems to suit the society, or the evangelical churches, which have kind of drifted off into this weird Jesus commercialism and propaganda stuff. And so he provides something I think is much needed, which is why he has gained a lot of attention. Now, one of my problems with him is, and I find it less with him than in some of the people who kind of come along after him, and I don't know if we'd call them their followers, but something like that. The people who are paying attention to Jonathan Pageau will say, there's a slight confusion between the symbolic and the allegorical. And keep in mind that the symbolic, as I discussed it 2 videos ago, is much more difficult to pin down to a specific meaning. That is to say, if I want to talk about the symbolism of scarecrows, well, you have a creature on a pole, looks a lot like a crucifix, but this also looks like a telephone pole. Are there relationships between these things? Symbolically, absolutely. And I find it really fascinating to note these things, that the thing on the pole, whether it's the snake on the pole in Exodus, or whether it's there's this emphasis of the thing, and it's usually a forbidden thing on the pole, which is why we get this creepy, whatever that word now means, use, like people see the scarecrow, make it a creepy creature. Well, I love that. I love creepy scarecrows, or eerie scarecrows. I like eerie better than creepy. Creepy has taken on these weird associations, both with the way women look at men and the way we look at past old handmade things. And our antidote to that has tended to be the nightmare of cuteness. So you now see cute scarecrows, which makes me I just go like, what are you doing? It's a scarecrow. Make the thing so it scares crows, make it interesting that way. Anyway, many of the people paying attention to Jonathan Pageau are paying too much attention, I think, to the symbol before, and this is the crucial thing, understanding the thing itself. In other words, I can tell you that the scarecrow is a highly symbolic creature. Well, yeah, I've spent time with scarecrows. You see, I'm not talking about the scarecrow. I didn't start off with the scarecrow as a symbol. I started off with the scarecrow is there to scare crows, which then gets me into a whole discussion about crows, a whole discussion about old rags on a pole. It's like this weathered, beaten thing. First you have to see the thing itself. And I think that there's a problem with taking Jonathan Pageau too glibly and not getting further down. I think before you can understand the symbol, you have to understand the thing. And so you have to spend time with scarecrows. It's just like I understand puppetry really well. You know why I understand puppetry really well? I've spent time with puppets. And I see the multitude of symbolic resonances within puppets. I'm not even going to begin to talk about that here because it's way too big. And if you see puppets, I want you to see a puppet show first. Not a cute one, but a real one. And I want you to be affected by the puppet. Then what happens after you're affected by the thing, you start to go, oh, wait a minute. This is doing something else. This has resonances. So for me, the thing itself is super important. It contains the germination for all the symbolic resonances given a time and a place and a culture. And I think there's another problem. For instance, one of the things I've seen in some of the places where people discuss Jonathan Pageau's ideas is they're immediately saying, what about this meme of Jesus? Here's a meme of Jesus. So you got an Orthodox picture of Jesus, you got some words here, and they switch all the time. I don't even want to start discussing them. Well, what is that symbolic of? Or, to which I'm going like, hello, you just shifted categories. If you have an image with words going across it to try to get something across, you are no longer in the realm of symbols. You're in the realm of manipulated symbols. And we have another word for that. It's called propaganda. And it doesn't matter if it's for or against Jesus. It's all the same. That is to say, what is propaganda? And this is what I think that people who are listening to Jonathan Pageau need to understand more of, is that you can strip symbols or use symbols to manipulate people. The Nazis were really good at this. The communists were good at this. Cult leaders are good at this. You can strip a symbol to a specific interpretation and then force that image upon us. That's why the National Socialists in Germany were so good at coming up with, Hitler was an artist. He realized that he could take certain symbols and because they were resonant, like the runes and the swastikas and the flags, even the clothing, and create images out there that were symbolic. He also knew that he could create images that were symbolic and fearful. And Jacques Ellul, in his book on propaganda, has a whole discussion of how myths and symbols can be used to manipulate people. And this is something I think people need to understand a bit more of. And but the truth is, I think Jonathan Pageau's emphasis on symbolism is highly needed at a time when we are killing symbols with way too much photography, way too much advertisement, way too much political propaganda, and way too many memes. And one way to do it is to understand that the symbols have a weight. Let me try to get you the idea between the symbol and the thing, and to help you to understand the difference. And this is why if you understand the thing first, it's much harder to be manipulated by the symbol. Let's say you never saw a rainbow, and now someone shows you certain rainbow flags. And suddenly it's like every time you now see a rainbow image, you're thinking of this reduced symbolic allegory of what the rainbow is. Well, that's really a terrible thing. And it means that most wondrous of creation, the rainbow. Owen Barfield spends quite a bit of time talking about what a rainbow is in the beginning of his book, Saving the Appearances, is now poisoned for you by the manipulated symbolic image of it. Let me ask you this question. I'm going to ask you what certain countries mean to you. Maybe you've been to this country, maybe you haven't. But I want you to think of this country just in your mind for a minute. Antarctica. I realize it's not really a country, but Antarctica. Think about it. What does Antarctica mean to you? I'm not even going to give you any images. I just want you to think of the images that you associate with Antarctica, because everyone's going to have different images. Ireland. What is Ireland to you? How do you see it? How do you think of it? California. What is California to you? Is it a great place? Is it a terrible place? And why? What are you seeing in your mind, especially if you're not from California? Japan. What is Japan to you? As you can see, a lot of it depends on what your relationship is, not only with the country, but cultural products from these places. Or here's one that you may draw a bit of a blank. New Guinea. What does New Guinea mean to you? Think about these things for a minute. Now, I'm going to just simply say this. Once upon a time, say back in 2012, when I first started thinking about the country of Georgia, which I'm now living in, I had certain images that I built up. And so Georgia became a symbolic place to me. Actually, all these places are symbolic places to me, and I gave them to you because I have symbolic resonances with all these places. Of them, I have not been to Antarctica, I have not been to Ireland, I have lived in California, I have not been to Japan, and I have not been to New Guinea. So those places I have not been to are just personally symbolic places. When you say those words and I start thinking about certain images or songs or whatever, I think about these things. But now, I think about Georgia. And so it starts off in my mind with the music that I've heard. It starts off with the videos I've seen on YouTube. It starts off with then reading. I read the great Shoto Rustaveli's Night in Panther's Skin. I read a bit more about the history of Georgia, started filling in more of the blanks. In other words, going from very, very low resolution to a little bit better of a resolution. I went to, from small JPEG to a larger JPEG, but certainly not a great photograph nor a great movie on the subject. When I arrived here, however, and I guarantee you I arrived with far more ammunition about the nature of the country than you ever will, nevertheless, the reality of the country went It just slammed me in the face with all the ways in which I wasn't thinking about it. And it has continued to do so over the year and a half that I've lived here. And so what I can tell you is this: the thing corrects your symbolic impression. It didn't make it go away, but I suddenly realized, and I think countries are interesting because we all have our symbolic countries. It's amazing. I'm here and I hear Georgians talk about New York City or California, two places I've lived in, and I just laugh because it's like, have you got any idea what these places are really like? I mean, I hear someone here from Georgia saying, yeah, I want to go live in New York City. I said, you're making 400 lari a month. That's like $150. You think you're going to go live in New York City? Or even within like 50 miles of New York City? You don't understand the nature of the beast. California, it's not like Eagle Song. So actually, maybe it is like Eagle Song, like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. So anyway, I just want you to put this distinction in your mind between the thing and the symbol. Now let's talk about Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield was one of the Inklings, a very close friend, one of C.S. Lewis's close friends, lived to be 99 years old. A very fascinating figure. I certainly don't agree with everything that Owen Barfield has said or written, particularly the closer he gets to Rudolf Steiner. I tend to put Rudolf Steiner in one category and Owen Barfield in another. I think part of that is because Owen Barfield is a subtler thinker. Now, one set of ideas that I think is important to get before discussing Barfield's ideas of symbolism is he uses three words: participation, idolatry, and final participation, to discuss his ideas about the history of the world and what he calls the evolution of consciousness. Now, one of the things is that in participation, what he means by participation is the way in which older civilizations and people tended to be enveloped by the world around them. So, for instance, whether it's African tribesmen who are afraid to dig in the ground because they don't want to let loose the spirits of the ground, whether it's in a sense, the Orthodox use of icons is very much in the older participation zone, although tempered by Christianity. So that, many people here treat the Christian symbols, the way Catholics are supposed to treat Roman Catholics are supposed to treat the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. That is to say that it's not simply a symbolic thing in that Protestant simplistic method, but rather something is going on, that there is a connection that's deep. So in participation, one sees a connection between the person and consciousness and the thing itself. Now, there are problems with old school participation. One of them is the concept of taboo. As I mentioned with the African tribesmen, you're not supposed to dig the earth because you'll let loose the spirits. Likewise, you're not supposed to go through a forest and chop the trees down because you'll let loose the spirits, or you will offend the gods, or you will, depending on the culture. So we now live in times where the concept of violating the spirits of nature, if it's held at all, even by people who are on the ecological left wing, kind of Gaia-minded, New Age kind of thoughts, they still don't have old school participation because they really don't believe if I chop a tree down, a spirit will jump out and get me. That is to say that they don't believe that their relationship to the thing is that strongly defined or that definite. So Barfield talks about, he in his great book, and a lot of this is kind of rehashing his book, Saving the Appearances, which I highly recommend reading, is that he basically is saying that what then happens, and it says it comes out of the Greek line of scientific and philosophical inquiry, and it comes out of the Judeo-Christian line of saying of God not being connected to the things of earth. You find a new attitude towards the world around us, and Hans Rookmaaker really boils this down in his What is Reality lecture, which I have mentioned many times. And I'm going to play you a bit of a section of Rookmaaker's What is Reality, where he talks about how the people in the Middle Ages looked at symbolism and reality versus how we look at symbolism and reality. I'm just going to play you this clip because Rookmaaker for me was like a cynosure. He was the place that was between all these places. He was between Michael Polanyi and Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis, but also all of this artwork. He understood art so well. And, and along with this, I would mention C.S. Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, because what he does is he talks about models of the universe and how in the Middle Ages, you couldn't possibly convince someone that there was something so repugnant as infinity. He says, now, up until the point of Jordan Peterson, essentially, you can't possibly convince a modern person that there's something so repugnant as hierarchy. So I recommend The Discarded Image as well. But I want to play you this clip from Hans Rookmaaker's lecture, What is Reality? And I'll put a link down below as to where you can find it.
The Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, of course, there's much of Christianity in the Middle Ages, but there's lots of the old paganism in the Middle Ages. And you see that in their thinking. For instance, they all believed in astrology. And astrology, of course, is tied up with participation. The gods are in the stars, and the movements of the stars are related to us. It's a vitalistic kind of thinking about the world. The Middle Ages are always thinking about the world in a qualitative sense. We always think in a quantitative sense. We make statistics. They never made statistics because you were not interested in the statistics, because you were interested in things what they are, not how many are there. You see? And so they talk about quantity. It's a substantial thinking. What is the meaning of this? What is its substance? In difference to our functional way of thinking into which I'm going in a few moments. May I just go on in these very fascinating things? If you talk about these things, for the medieval man, in his Bible interpretation, but also in his interpretation of things like this, he said you can look at things in the literal way, in a moral way, in an allegorical way, and in an anagogical way. That is the direction it takes. I'm not going to explain these things, and probably you know about this, but their literal was also what we call symbolic. There was no difference. That was the same, because things are loaded with meaning, and the symbol is the meaning of things. So they make no difference there. What they call literal is including what we call symbol. I can try to explain to you. What is the United States flag? And I would say the United States flag is very interesting. It's a United States flag. And I can never get around. The United States flag is not a piece of cotton with some symbols attached to it. The United States flag is a United States flag. It is a symbolic. You can never get them outside of each other. And I think we still can feel this. The United States flag is literally the United States flag, although the flagness of the flag is symbolic. You see, it's the same. And in this way, medieval man understood everything. We try to get these things out of each other.
What modern consciousness did is strip all of that connection off. And basically, once you've stripped it off, there isn't a way to get it back. That is to say, you can never go back to... Once you believe that, you can go ahead and do scientific research on everything, that all images can be used or abused for artistic purposes, there is no way of going back. And now different cultures around the world still hold to older conceptions. For instance, in the Middle Ages, they were relatively free of many of the older pagan ideas, but they still but they still had many, many superstitions and many, many taboos within that society in Western Europe. But eventually you get to the point where idolatry, and he uses the word idolatry specifically to say, he talks about the idol. And, you could have an idol as a representation of, say, an event or a representation of a spirit. But what it is it's just a piece of stone or wood. And it doesn't relate back to what it was about at all. For instance, if lightning struck a tree and everyone, well, that would be a pretty powerful event to witness, and say some people witnessed it, and they would keep coming back to the split tree. But now eventually the split tree is going to fall apart. So what they do is they take parts of the split tree and carve lightning gods out of it. And but while that brings back to their mind a memory of it, it is killing the meaning of it, because it is now turning it into an object. We use the word objectification when we discuss a bad way to treat women. Well, what that means is that women are so much more than we can be put into any artistic bottle, or photographic bottle, or sculpture or whatever. So we say, and if you treat a woman as an object, you've made her an idol, but you've also reduced her meaning. So that's essentially what we've done to everything. No more so than every time you pick up your cell phone and look at the world. I mean, it's just that simple. Every time you look at your smartphone, why are we even calling them phones anymore? You're looking at things. And that thing you're looking at is so abstracted from the meaning of the thing itself. Well, I've discussed this at other points. Then Barfield comes to what he calls final participation. And final participation means through an act of the imagination, we can go back, and whether through historical imagination or whether through creative interaction, we can go back and connect to the world around us in a different way, freer than during the days of participation, but much more respectful than during the days of idolatry. Well, we are still in the realm of idolatry. Everyone in the modern, postmodern, hypermodern, however you want to call it, world, we're still there. So Barfield is basically saying, though, that we can connect once again, but the difference is what used to happen naturally now has to happen on purpose. So what used to happen naturally is that people would sing at a funeral, sad, beautiful songs. And now it no longer happens, except in rare cases. That is to say, I've been at funerals where people just played a recording, someone's favorite recording, which is just a reduction of a reduction of a reduction, making the funeral almost just a sad, empty joke. And I don't mean this. I've been to these funerals where myself, I had to find a recording for a funeral. I tried to make it as respectful as possible. I was asked to do this for someone that was in my family that I loved. And I just find it to be like, it's just like, is this what we're reduced to? I've told people, when I die, do not have a celebration of my death in my life. Have a funeral, mourn, weep, sing beautiful songs, please, if you can. If you know any. Well, the difference is what used to happen naturally in the past now has to happen by choice. And the problem is you have enough people now who are disconnected from everything that you can't do it by. It's hard to get them to choose to do something beautiful and meaningful. Owen Barfield then goes on to talk about the way words give us an insight into the way the past used to be, and how the consciousness of people in the past and the consciousness of reality in the past. So in his book, History in English Words, he talks about how language went from the highly dense language to a prosaic language. Meaning, if you don't quite get what I'm saying, it went from being a language which was rich and full of just, resonance, to being a language which just describes, and sometimes just jokingly describes, things around us in the most simplistic level. You can see this in if you go back into the past. We often use different words to translate both the Greek word pneuma and the Hebrew word ruach. Ruach, which is used in the beginning of the Bible, the Spirit of God was on the face of the waters. That spirit word there is ruach. But back then the word wasn't spirit, it also meant wind and breath. So there were three meanings to it. And so whenever you said it, now depending on your meaning, it would kind of, we say, oh, it means this now, it means that now. But what spirit then means is it has to do with the breath, the thing inside that keeps everything alive, the wind that blows through everything. The Greeks had essentially a very close, both of these are older, pre-medieval cultures, pre-classic, during the classical period. The Greeks' pneuma was wind or air in motion, and it was also breath and spirit. So every time a person spoke these words, they didn't just speak them in isolation. They just didn't say, hey, nice wind today. The other parts of the word were also there at the same time. That is to say, they were nice spirit today, nice breath today. You see? So it wasn't just this thing. I'm not just respiring. I'm also, the wind is coming in and out of me. The spirit is coming in and out of me. It was this the world was dense and poetic. That's one of the reasons why our poetry is terrible these days. I mean, I've heard poems that didn't sound like poems at all because they were just prosaic, which is to say the very opposite of a poem. They just describe something without giving you any depth, because in modern and postmodern culture, the whole point has been to empty all that poetic meaning out and to add our own little funny jokes and ironies on top of it, or to redo completely what it means to be human or what it means to be an animal. Every time someone calls me a species, I'm just like, is that it? Is that what you think I am? You think I'm a species? Period. End of story. Somehow I don't think I am. But that's been part of the whole modernist project, is to empty out all of these things you can't weigh, measure, put in some sort of device to calculate and get a quantitative idea about. Get rid of those. Keep those, the quantitative things, but get rid of all the qualitative things. Or just interpret them any way you wish until it becomes a tyranny where suddenly a new group comes along and says, well, this is how we all now interpret this thing. You're on board, right? So, and you see this a lot with the concepts of gender. Basically what it means to be human and has been thrown out the window because those were old-fashioned ideas we now agree were obsolete. I just read a great line by Ambrose Bierce in his Devil's Dictionary where he says, obsolete is a word used by the timid. Who cares if it's old? Use it, as he's talking about words and such. But anyway, you can see how we've moved from, in our daily language, in America, we use a lot of just really bad prosaic words. I mean, consider this word, to deplane or detrain, which means basically get off the plane, get off the train. It's a totally prosaic, rather stupid neologisms. These didn't exist when I was younger. People used to say things like disembark. It means to get off. And to, in Britain, when I still go there, it's like when when you're on the tube on the subway, they say things like, alight from, which it's just like, oh, I'd much rather alight than D metro or D subway or D tube, D train. I'd much rather alight. How you get off, and because that still has this other, it comes from a time, when words were used with more care. In America, we tend to just go absolutely insane with making words more and more understandable and less opaque. So, for instance, there used to be a word called inflammable, which means something could burst into flames. Comes from the Latin inflammare. And then we had these big trucks that were carrying things like gasoline and diesel. So we needed to put something on the side. So then people became afraid of the stupidity of people who would think that inflammable means not burst into flames, because sometimes in means not. So rather than teach every school student that inflammable means it is capable of bursting into flames, in order to get rid of that, any sort of confusion, they made the word flammable. So, which then is, wait a minute, where did this word come from? It's a stupid word. It's a word that is there because not only are they afraid of the stupidity of people, they just say, well, you can't work with it, so we might as well keep them stupid. They're going to be stupid. They're going to smoke around flammable things. The truth is, the people who are going to smoke around inflammable things and don't notice a diesel truck are the same people who are going to misread the word anyway, and it doesn't really matter. But then you come up with, well, then there's non-flammable. But then sometimes people use the word unflammable. It all gets confusing because people can't that's the reason why the naming of the decades of whatever the last decade was before the teens, even teens became tens for some ridiculous reason, but it was the teens as it was before that in the 20th century. But then, the first decade of the century, and I go on about this because it is amazing how stupid we've become, that because the word oughts sounded old-fashioned and obsolete, see Ambrose Bierce on timidity, that people, the O's, the thousands, whatever, people became stupid about it. I was glad to hear, who was it? Simon Whistler, who does all these news and information videos, called the first decade of the 20th century the aughts. And I was like, thank you, finally, someone gets the name of the thing. But we do that because, people are afraid of not looking cool. And what is cool? Cool is prosaic living. Cool is living without any poetry in life. Cool is living so that nothing affects you. You see? And finally, and I'm getting back to the symbolic here in a moment. And in a sense, we have in the mid-20th century, there was people often say, well, just do it in a common sense sort of manner. And Owen Barfield has a great take on common sense. Common sense changes. The common sense of the Victorian era in England is very different from the common sense in 21st century America, what is considered common sense. So in other words, common sense is nothing you can rely on because it changes. But that what we now call kind of our baseline for common sense, well, there was a baseline from the mid-20th century that was kind of like if you watch film noir, and you'll see what people thought was common sense then. You'll see people using gambling metaphors and racing metaphors and dice metaphors. You'll see them using war metaphors, and they're very much nuts and bolts. They're very much a modernist aesthetic versus today, which is very postmodern. So our common sense includes all the stupidity that we find in our handheld devices. That is to say, suddenly the new common sense, in other words, the sense that we all share. And this is where I want to finally get to Barfield's kind of against Jung. Barfield discusses common sense as he uses this phrase, the collective conscious. And he uses it as, well, he says this, and this is talking about Jung. So this is, do a little section here on Jung versus Barfield, because I think they're very interesting. He says, I think it will be very strange to the historian of the future that a literal-minded generation began to accept the actuality of a collective unconscious before it could even admit the possibility of a collective conscious in the shape of the phenomenal world. In other words, Barfield says there's much more of a relationship between us and the things outside of our windows than we would like to imagine. He also says, and he talks about, this is Barfield in Saving the Appearances, talking about Jung. He says, we have watched with interest Jung developing his concept of a collective unconscious of humanity as a whole, as a concept which is inherently repugnant to the foundation of idolatry on which he had to build it. In other words, Jung was building on the idolatrous platform of modernism. There was a relationship between him and Freud. Freud is definitely the modernist who's pulling things to pieces to see how they work. The postmodernist puts them back without necessarily referring to the owner's manual. And many postmodernists will say, well, there isn't one, and it's all up to interpretation, to which I'm going like, yeah, right. If you treat someone however you wish, you're just kind of being selfish, and we know that's not a good thing. But he basically says that Barfield describes a thing called RUP, which means essentially, what is it? It's a residue of unexamined positivism. And that basically he says this, continuing on about Barfield, positivism being essentially another word for the materialistic, empirical view that all there is what you can weigh, measure, and feel. Anything outside of that really isn't up for discussion. It's just whatever it is, but it doesn't matter that much. Whereas, of course, all of life is in that category, and only numbers and a few engineering tricks are on the other side. But Barfield goes on, he says, because of that very idolatry, and that is the idolatry of positivism, the idolatry of the materialistic world, that kind of, cynical worldview, he says, the traditional myths and archetypes which Jung tells us are representations of the collective unconscious are assumed by him and assumed to be, and always have been, neatly insulated from the world of nature with which, according to their account, they were mingled or united. So what he's doing is he's saying that these archetypes of Jung, these symbolic archetypes, he still, like I said, there's this repository somewhere, this collective unconscious, who knows where it is, that Jung is pulling stuff from, and that's where we get it from. But he says it's completely unconnected to the world around us. In other words, he wants to make sure that he keeps the material world totally modernistic, and that there's no, in other words, it's the material world is still this science world, science in the hardened sense, not science as discussed by, say, someone like Michael Polanyi, but it's this sense that all there is what you can weigh and measure. If you can't weigh and measure it, it's not real. But Jung keeps his collective unconscious, Francis Schaeffer would say, above the line. That is, say, the line is, below the line is rationalism, materialism, despair, but Jung keeps his hope up here in a bubble somewhere, we don't know what it is. Barfield is actually saying it's in the stuff and our relationship to the stuff. And this is a really tough concept that I'm not going to go into right now because I don't want to go on for another hour, and I don't think you want me to go on for another hour. One more quote from Barfield here about Jung. And then we'll be done with Barfield and Jung for a moment here. As far as I can make out, when all's said and done, Jung's idea of the myths and archetypes they employ is based on some kind of projection by the unconscious mind of its imagery onto a detached and pre-existing outer world of nature. If so, it is our old friend animism all over again. In other words, in this interpretation, animism is just us putting the spirits on the stuff. And what Barfield is suggesting is that there are things going on in the things themselves, which we don't understand, nor do we understand what those things really are. For instance, if you go to, say, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which you can go to online, although I like the big heavy books, and you look up something like a crow or a raven, something like that, a corvid bird, you'll see all of this stuff about it, and even the mention that it's a symbolic creature for a raven and such. But when you actually watch the raven or the crow, it's something very different than what they're describing in those books as far as the way it looks back at you. There's something about it. And here's the point. And here's what he's trying to say. And I'm sure he would say this now if he had seen the cell phones. Us looking at ravens and crows through the cell phone, it does two things. It changes our relationship to ravens and crows, but ultimately it's going to change the ravens and crows. Now, that's tough to understand. I suggest reading Owen Barfield's Saving the Appearances. I'm not going to go any further on that line because it's a different thing. But the point is that the symbolic isn't just our interpretation upon the thing, that the things themselves are part of the ground of the symbolic, and that we interact with it. And as our relationship, and his whole point is as our consciousness changes as a result of what we do, then things change. For instance, because of our consciousness about containers and how liquids should be stored, the oceans have changed. We did that just by changing our sense of consciousness. The ocean is no longer what it was. It is now something else. It becomes a container because we invented plastic, and we had this mindset that plastic, well, what's wrong with plastic? We saw plastic as an idol that we could use to pour our stuff into or carry our stuff with it. The oceans are now full of plastic, which changes the nature of what an ocean is, down to practically, I don't know if it's all the way to the cellular level, but it's pretty small, those particles of plastic. We did that. And he talks about the relationship of human beings to mountains, and how mountains used to be these fearful, dark places until the Romantics came up with an idea that mountains were a spiritual place to go to. So the Romantics then said people should go look at mountains. And now think about how mountains have changed, not only in our eyes, but the structures themselves, because we constantly are building hotels on them. I mean, that's a change to the mountain as a result. And what Owen Barfield would say is if you could go back to the time of Christ, it isn't what you're thinking. You would not, if you could see through the eyes of someone in that period of time, you would see different things. And there would be different things there. Does he mean it in terms of the miracles and such? I'm not sure. Miracles of Christ, definitely. But it's really complicated, and I don't want to go any further. A good place to start, if you want to understand these things, is Hans Rookmaaker's lecture, What is Reality? Because I want you to understand that the world we live in, symbolically, really depends so much on our interactions. So that the symbols aren't simply there, but yet at the same time, every time you see a telephone pole, a scarecrow, a crucifix, you get that inner connection between the up and the across, between heaven and earth. And the fact that it's often something kind of terrible hanging in the middle there, the crucifixion. That's not an accident. It's the shapes that things, there is an interaction between us and the things around us. So, well, I hope I made myself at all clear. These are difficult things to discuss, and I probably said more than I could actually explain to you. And I hope, like I say, I hope you got something out of this. Before I get out of here, I would like to say, hey, if you appreciated this, do share it with friends. Share it with people you think might appreciate it as well. Also, hit like. Somehow that makes a difference. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you really liked it, and if you really like what I'm doing for some reason, I don't know why, but if you really like it, then you can actually, there's a PayPal link in the description below. Go ahead and sign up. If you give me, we'll say $5 or more a month, I will give you extra material. And I'll send it to you. And right now I've got about 8, 9, 10 hours of extra material I'm sending to people who contribute at least $50 worth. So one-time shot of $50 or more, or if you do it, someone did it in 3 different installments, got over $50, they got their stuff. But I just want to, give you something for your money. So if you feel like supporting me, I could use it. But you know what? A lot of people could use it right now. So if you know anyone else who could use it more than me, give it to them. And again, thanks for listening. And remember, anadromous is a word describing salmon swimming up against the stream to go finally spawn and die. And, I'm not going to die right away, but, we all are going to die. So swim against the stream to get back home. And this is Byrne. I will see you again. Well, no, I won't, because I don't see you. You'll see me. We'll meet again soon.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.